The smoke rose straight and clean from Matthias Kern's chimney, while 3 cabins down the valley filled with choking gray clouds that forced families into the killing cold. It was the 3rd day of the blizzard of 1843, with winds strong enough to tear bark from trees and snow so thick a man couldn't see his own outstretched hand. Inside his cabin, Matthias sat by a fire that burned steady and hot, the interior dry and warm, while elsewhere in the Montana wilderness trappers were making impossible choices between suffocation and freezing. What separated his survival from their suffering was a chimney design so ungainly and expensive that his neighbors had spent 2 years calling it the stupidest thing they'd ever seen built on the frontier. Before we go further into how one German trapper's obsession with smoke and wind changed winter survival across the Rockies, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what the winters are like in your part of the Prov world. And if stories about frontier innovation and the men who refused to accept that things had to be done the old way speak to you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale is even more remarkable than this one. The winter of 1841 came early to the Montana Territory. By late October, snow already lay 3 feet deep in the valleys, and the temperature dropped low enough to freeze whiskey solid in its bottle. Matthias Kern and Owen Talbot had prepared well for the season. Their cabin sat in a protected hollow near the Bitterroot River, surrounded by dense pine forests that provided both firewood and windbreak. They had laid in supplies for 5 months of isolation: salted meat, dried beans, flour, coffee, and enough powder and lead to hunt fresh game when the weather permitted. The cabin itself was solid work, built the previous summer using carefully fitted logs and thick clay chinking. They had constructed it in the standard way that mountain men had been, building shelters for decades. The chimney rose from one corner of the cabin, built from river stones mortared with clay and sand. It stood 6 feet above the roofline and drew well under normal conditions. Smoke from their fire vented cleanly, and the interior stayed warm enough to work without heavy coats. For the first month of winter, everything functioned as expected. They ran their trap lines when weather permitted, processed the few beaver pelts they collected, and spent long evenings maintaining equipment and telling stories. Owen was from Pennsylvania, a carpenter's son who had come west 5 years earlier, seeking adventure and profit. Matthias had emigrated from Bavaria 7 years before, working first as a laborer in street. Louis, before the lure of the mountains pulled him away from civilization. They were competent trappers, neither exceptional nor careless. They understood the risks of mountain life and took reasonable precautions. But reasonable precautions assumed that your shelter functioned as shelter. On December 9, 1841, a blizzard moved into their valley with unusual speed. The temperature plunged, wind screamed through the pine forest. Snow fell so heavily that visibility dropped to mere feet. Matthias and Owen secured themselves inside the cabin, added wood to the fire, and prepared to wait out the storm. That was when the chimney stopped working. The wind hit from the north with enough force to create a pressure differential that reversed the chimney's natural draft. Instead of smoke rising and exiting through the top of the chimney, the wind forced it back down. Smoke poured from the fireplace into the cabin. Within minutes, the interior filled with thick, choking smoke. They couldn't see. They couldn't breathe properly. They had 2 choices: let the fire die and face freezing temperatures with no heat source, or keep the fire burning and endure the smoke. They chose to keep the fire burning. The alternative was freezing to death, which seemed worse than temporary discomfort from smoke. Matthias and Owen wrapped cloth around their faces and stayed low to the floor where the air was marginally clearer. They took turns going outside every few hours to clear their lungs, but the blizzard made even brief exposure dangerous. The wind chill was severe enough to cause frostbite in minutes. Snow accumulated so rapidly that they had to dig out the door each time they opened it. The blizzard lasted 3 days. During that time, the cabin remained filled with smoke whenever the fire burned. The wind never stopped long enough for normal chimney draft to resume. Matthias and Owen developed brutal coughs. Their eyes burned constantly. Soot covered every surface inside the cabin. Sleep was nearly impossible because lying down meant breathing the densest concentration of smoke near the floor. Standing meant breathing slightly better air, but exhaustion made standing for hours impossible. They existed in a gray twilight of suffering, keeping the fire just large enough to prevent freezing, but small enough to minimize smoke production. Owen's cough worsened on the second day. By the third day, he was struggling to breathe, even when they briefly cleared the cabin by opening the door and letting cold air sweep through. His lips had taken on a grayish color. He spoke in short, labored sentences. Matthias recognized the signs of serious smoke inhalation, but there was nothing he could do except wait for the blizzard to end. On the morning of the fourth day, the wind finally stopped. The chimney resumed its normal draw. Smoke cleared from the cabin. Matthias opened the door and window to flush out the remaining haze. Fresh, cold air poured inside. He turned to check on Owen and found his partner unconscious on the sleeping platform. Owen Talbot died 2 hours later without regaining consciousness. His lungs had been too damaged by 3 days of constant smoke exposure. Matthias buried Owen a week later when the ground thawed enough to dig. He piled stones over the grave to protect it from animals and spent that night sitting alone in the cabin, staring at the fireplace that had killed his partner. The fire burned clean now. The chimney worked perfectly. But that perfect function meant nothing during the blizzard when it had mattered most. Other mountain men would have grieved, accepted the loss as part of frontier life's brutal calculus, and moved on. Matthias couldn't let it go. He kept thinking about those 3 days. The wind forcing smoke back down the chimney. The impossible choice between freezing and suffocating. The fact that Owen had survived 7 winters in the mountains only to die inside a shelter that was supposed to protect him. Matthias realized something that night that would consume him for the next 18 months. The problem wasn't bad luck or an unusually severe storm. The problem was that every chimney built in the standard way had the same fatal weakness. When wind conditions were right, or rather wrong, any chimney could become a death trap. Matthias spent the remainder of that winter alone in the cabin, obsessively studying his chimney. He watched how it behaved in different wind conditions. When wind came from the south, the chimney drew perfectly. East or west winds created minor turbulence, but nothing serious. North winds, especially strong ones, created the deadly downdraft that had killed Owen. He began to understand that the problem was directional and related to how wind hit the top of the chimney opening. He sketched diagrams in the margins of an old ledger book. He drew the chimney from different angles, marking wind direction with arrows and noting what happened to smoke under various conditions. His drawings were crude but detailed. He wasn't an educated man, but he had a practical mind that understood cause and effect. Wind hitting the chimney opening from certain angles created pressure that forced smoke downward instead of allowing it to rise naturally. The question was how to prevent that without blocking the chimney entirely. When spring came and travel became possible again, Matthias didn't leave the mountains to sell furs as most trappers did. Instead, he visited every trapper camp within 3 days' travel. He talked to anyone who would listen about chimneys and winter storms. Most men thought his obsession was strange. Chimneys worked, or they didn't. Everyone dealt with occasional smoke problems. That was just how things were. But Matthias pressed for details. Had their chimneys ever failed during blizzards? How long had smoke filled their cabins? Had anyone died or come close to dying? The stories he collected were consistent and disturbing. Nearly every experienced trapper had a story about smoke-filled cabins during severe storms. Several men had abandoned their shelters midwinter and nearly frozen to death because staying inside meant suffocating. 2 trappers mentioned friends who had died in circumstances similar to Owen's death. Everyone accepted these incidents as unavoidable tragedies, acts of God or nature that couldn't be prevented. Matthias disagreed. If the problem was consistent and predictable, then it could be solved. He examined dozens of chimneys that spring. They were all built the same way. Stone or clay structures rising above rooflines with open tops that allowed smoke to escape. The design was simple, ancient, and fundamentally flawed. When strong winds hit those open tops from certain angles, the airflow created pressure waves that reversed the natural convection, drawing smoke upward. Matthias began to think about solutions. His first instinct was to build a simple cap over the chimney, opening to block wind from above. But that created a new problem. A solid cap would trap smoke underneath it. The smoke needed somewhere to go. He thought about building angled deflectors on the sides where wind typically came from, but wind in the Mountains came from every direction depending on the storm. A deflector that worked for north winds would be useless against east or west winds. He needed a solution that worked regardless of wind direction. That was the puzzle that occupied his mind through the entire summer of 1842. The answer came to Matthias while watching smoke rise from a campfire on a windy afternoon. He had built the fire in a small clearing surrounded by tall pines. The wind blew steadily from the west, but the smoke didn't blow straight sideways as he expected. Instead, it rose vertically for several feet before the wind caught it and pushed it east. The trees created a protected zone immediately above the fire, where air pressure was lower than the surrounding area. Smoke rose into that zone naturally, then dispersed once it cleared the protection. Matthias realized he could create the same effect with a chimney. If he built a cap large enough to shield the chimney opening from direct wind, but left a gap between the cap and the opening, smoke could rise into that protected space and then exit in whatever direction the wind allowed. The cap wouldn't block the smoke because the smoke wouldn't be trying to go through the cap. It would exit sideways, finding the path of least resistance around the edges. He spent 2 weeks testing the concept using small models. He built miniature chimneys from clay and created tiny caps from wood and bark. He burned green leaves to create smoke and observed how it behaved with different cap heights and gap sizes. The models were crude, but they proved the basic principle worked. Smoke rose into the gap space beneath the cap and found its way out regardless of which direction wind came from. When he blew on the models to simulate wind, the smoke still escaped cleanly. The critical variables were the size of the gap and the size of the cap itself. Too small a gap and smoke would be trapped. Too large a gap and wind would penetrate underneath and create the same downdraft problem as no cap at all. The cap needed to extend well beyond the chimney opening to create an adequate protected zone. After dozens of tests, Matthias determined that the gap should be approximately 12 to 18 inches and the cap should extend at least 6 inches past the chimney opening on all sides. But building a functional cap presented practical challenges. It needed to be elevated above the chimney, which meant it needed supports. Those supports had to be strong enough to hold the cap steady in severe winds. The cap itself needed to be large enough and angled properly to shed snow and deflect wind. Wood wouldn't work because it would eventually rot or burn from heat. Stone was too heavy to suspend above the chimney. The only material that made sense was metal, specifically iron. Iron was expensive on the frontier. A simple iron pot cost several beaver pelts. The amount of iron Matthias would need for his chimney cap would cost more than most trappers earned in half a season. He would need sheet iron for the cap itself, probably 20 to 30 pounds. He would need iron straps or rods for the support posts, another 15 to 20 pounds. He would need fasteners and brackets. The total cost would be substantial, and that assumed he could even find someone capable of fabricating the components he needed. In August of 1842, Matthias made the journey to Fort Benton, a trading post on the Missouri River where trappers sold furs and purchased supplies. The trip took 6 days on horseback. He brought what remained of his previous season's earnings, a modest collection of beaver and mink pelts worth perhaps $80 in trade goods. Most trappers would have spent that money on powder, lead, coffee, tobacco, and maybe a new rifle if they needed one. Matthias had different priorities. The trading post was run by Nathaniel Cross, a former blacksmith from Ohio who had come west and discovered that selling goods to trappers was more profitable than trapping itself. Cross operated a forge behind his main trading building where he repaired rifles, made simple tools, and occasionally fabricated custom metalwork for customers willing to pay premium prices. Matthias found Cross working on a set of beaver traps, bending steel springs into precise curves. Matthias explained what he needed. A large pyramidal cap made from sheet iron, approximately 3 feet square at the base, tapering to a peaked top. 4 iron posts, each 18 inches long and sturdy enough to support the cap's weight in high winds. Brackets to attach the posts to stone. All components needed to withstand extreme temperature variations and severe weather. Cross listened without interrupting, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dimensions and how the pieces would fit together. When Matthias finished describing the project, Cross calculated costs. The sheet iron alone would cost $30. The posts and brackets would add another $15. Labor for fabrication would be $25 because the work was custom and would take several days. Total cost, $70. Matthias's furs were worth approximately $80. He would have almost nothing left for other supplies. Cross asked what the contraption was for. Matthias explained the chimney problem, Owen's death, and his theory about creating a protected gap that would allow smoke to escape regardless of wind direction. Cross considered this silently for a long moment. Then he asked why Matthias thought an expensive iron cap would work better than simply accepting that chimneys sometimes failed during bad storms. Every trapper dealt with smoke problems occasionally. That was frontier life. Matthias's response was simple. Owen Talbot had been 32 years old, experienced and careful. He died because the shelter that was supposed to protect him became a death trap when weather turned severe. If a better chimney design could prevent that from happening to someone else, the cost was justified. Cross remained skeptical but agreed to fabricate the components. He told Matthias to return in 1 week. Matthias spent that week camped near the trading post, living on minimal rations and watching Cross work the iron. Other trappers came and went, conducting their business. Several asked Matthias what Cross was building. When Matthias explained, the reactions were universally dismissive. One trapper named Elias Drummond laughed outright and said Matthias was wasting money on the stupidest contraption he'd ever heard of. A chimney cap that didn't even cover the chimney? Ridiculous. The name stuck. By the time Matthias left Fort Benton with his iron components, word had spread about Kern's stupid chimney. Matthias returned to his cabin in early September with $70 worth of iron strapped to his pack horse and almost no supplies for the coming winter. He would need to trap aggressively once the season started. First, he had to rebuild his chimney. The existing stone structure was adequate for the base, but it needed to be taller and more precisely constructed to support the cap system properly. He spent 3 days dismantling the top 4 feet of the old chimney and rebuilding it with careful attention to creating a level, square top surface. The new chimney top measured exactly 2 feet square. He used flat river stones for the uppermost course, selecting each piece for its shape and fitting them together with minimal mortar gaps. The surface needed to be level because the iron posts would rest on it and any tilt would create structural weakness. He used a length of wood and a small bottle of water as a makeshift level, adjusting stones until water in the bottle showed a perfectly horizontal surface. Mounting the iron posts required drilling into stone, something Matthias had never attempted before. He used a star drill, a hardened steel rod with a cross-shaped tip, and a heavy hammer. The final process was brutally slow. He would strike the drill, rotate it slightly, strike again, rotate, building depth a tiny fraction at a time. Each of the 4 mounting holes took an entire day to drill to a depth of 3 inches. His hands blistered, then calloused, then blistered again underneath the calluses. He set the iron posts into the holes using a mixture of melted lead and crushed stone. The lead filled the gaps around the posts and hardened into a grip stronger than mortar. The posts stood vertical, 18 inches tall, positioned at the 4 corners of the chimney top. They were iron straps, 2 inches wide and a 1/4 inch thick, substantial enough to resist bending in high winds. Cross had done excellent work. Each post had a mounting bracket at the top, a U-shaped piece that would cradle the cap's edges. The cap itself was a pyramidal structure made from 4 triangular panels of sheet iron joined at the peak. Each panel measured approximately 20 inches from base to peak. The edges were folded and riveted together, creating joints that wouldn't separate. The entire cap weighed nearly 30 pounds, heavy enough to resist being blown off, but light enough that the 4 posts could support it. Matthias lifted the cap into position and secured it to the post brackets using iron pins that Cross had provided. The completed structure looked exactly as absurd as Elias Drummond had predicted. The cap sat 18 inches above the chimney opening, supported by 4 iron posts, extending well beyond the stone chimney on all sides. It was ungainly, obviously expensive, and completely unlike any chimney anyone had ever seen. Matthias didn't care how it looked. He cared whether it would work when winter came and the wind tried to kill him the way it had killed Owen. The first significant test came in late October when an early storm brought high winds and heavy snow. Matthias sat inside his cabin with a fire burning hot, watching smoke rise through the chimney, opening into the gap beneath the iron cap. The wind came from the northwest, strong enough to rattle the door and whistle through tiny gaps in the log walls. Under normal circumstances, wind from that direction would have created downdraft in his old chimney design. But the smoke rose cleanly into the protected space beneath the cap and exited on the southeast side where wind pressure was lowest. He went outside during the storm to observe the cap from ground level. Snow accumulated on the angled iron surfaces but slid off before building up significantly. The cap shed precipitation naturally because of its pyramidal shape. Wind hit the iron panels and was deflected upward and sideways, exactly as Matthias had hoped. The gap remained clear. Smoke emerged from beneath the cap in a steady stream, bending with the wind once it cleared the protected zone, but never being forced back down into the chimney. Inside, the cabin stayed completely smoke-free. The fire burned with excellent draft, pulling air through the gaps around the door and window, feeding the flames efficiently, sending smoke upward without hesitation. The temperature inside remained comfortable. Matthias didn't need to make the impossible choice between freezing and suffocating. The chimney simply worked. Over the next 6 weeks he tested the system under every condition Montana weather offered. Winds from different directions, light snow, heavy snow, freezing rain, extreme cold that dropped below zero for days at a time. The cap performed flawlessly in every situation. The key was the gap and the size of the protective zone. Smoke always found a way out because there were always at least 2 sides of the gap where wind pressure was low enough to allow escape. Matthias kept detailed notes in his ledger book. He recorded wind direction, approximate wind speed based on observable effects, temperature, and how the chimney performed. His notes showed consistent success. Not once did smoke back up into the cabin. Not once did the cap fail to shed snow. The iron posts remained rigid and showed no signs of weakening. The structure was sound. Word of his chimney had spread among the scattered trapping community during the fall. Several trappers stopped by his cabin, ostensibly to trade news or borrow supplies, but really to see the stupid chimney that Kern had wasted $70 building. Jacob Pine, an older trapper who had worked the Rockies for 15 years, studied the design carefully and asked thoughtful questions about gap size and cap dimensions. Elias Drummond stopped by in early November, looked at the chimney, shook his head, and said Matthias would regret the expense when the cap blew off in a real storm. Matthias told Drummond he hoped they'd both survive to see whether that prediction came true. Drummond laughed and rode away. 3 weeks later, the blizzard of 1843 arrived and proved who understood chimneys and who did not. The blizzard arrived on the PT Everplain, January 7, 1843, with a temperature drop so severe that Matthias heard trees cracking in the forest as sap froze and expanded. The wind built gradually through the morning, then exploded into full fury by midday. Snow fell so thick that the world disappeared into white chaos. Matthias secured his cabin, brought in extra firewood, and prepared to wait out what was clearly going to be a significant storm. By evening, the wind had reached velocities he had never experienced. It screamed across the valley with a sound like sustained thunder. Snow didn't fall so much as fly horizontally, driven by wind that had to be moving 50 or 60 miles per hour. Trees bent. Smaller pines snapped. The cabin shuddered under periodic gusts that tested every log and joint. Matthias built up his fire and watched his chimney through the gaps in the shuttered window. The cap held. Wind hammered it from every direction as the storm rotated through the valley, but the iron posts didn't bend and the cap didn't shift. More importantly, smoke continued to rise from the chimney opening, enter the protected gap, and exit cleanly. The fire drew perfectly. Inside the cabin, air quality remained clear. The temperature stayed warm enough that Matthias could work without heavy outer layers. He had heat, he had shelter, and he had smoke-free air. Everything Owen hadn't had 2 winters before. The blizzard lasted 3 full days. During that time, Matthias lived comfortably. He cooked meals over his fire, melted snow for water, read from a book of Shakespeare plays he had carried west from St. Louis, and slept soundly. The chimney never faltered. On the second day, during a brief lull in the snow, he went outside to check the structure. The cap had accumulated a layer of ice on its windward side, but the leeward sides remained clear. The gap was fully functional. Snow hadn't blocked anything critical. He thought about Owen constantly during those 3 days. His partner had died in conditions less severe than this. The blizzard that killed Owen had been terrible, but this storm was worse. Stronger winds, colder temperatures, heavier snow. Yet Matthias sat warm and safe, breathing clean air, alive because he had refused to accept that chimneys had to fail during extreme weather. The $70 he had spent suddenly seemed like the best investment he had ever made. On the 4th day, the wind stopped as suddenly as it had started. Silence settled over the valley, profound and strange after 3 days of constant roar. Matthias opened his door and stepped into a transformed landscape. Snow had drifted 15 feet deep in places. Trees were buried to their middle branches. The world was white and still and impossibly beautiful. His chimney cap stood above it all, ice-covered but intact, smoke still rising clean and steady into the crystalline air. Matthias wondered how his neighbors had fared and whether their standard chimneys had protected them, or betrayed them, the way his old chimney had betrayed Owen. Matthias got his answer on the 5th day after the blizzard, when he saw a figure struggling through the deep snow toward his cabin. The man was moving slowly, stopping frequently, clearly exhausted. Matthias grabbed his rifle reflexively, then recognized the gait and build. Silas Hartwell, a young trapper who had a cabin about 4 miles southeast along the river valley. Matthias waded out through the snow to help him cover the final 100 yards. Silas collapsed inside the cabin, his face gray with exhaustion and cold. His eyebrows and beard were thick with ice. His hands shook violently. Matthias got him close to the fire, wrapped him in a blanket, and heated water for coffee. It took 20 minutes before Silas could speak coherently. When he finally did, the story tumbled out in broken sentences between fits of coughing. The blizzard had nearly killed him. His chimney had failed on the 1st day, exactly as Matthias's old chimney had failed 2 years before. Wind-driven downdraft had forced smoke back into his cabin. He had faced the same impossible choice: freeze or suffocate. He had tried to keep the fire small, just enough for minimal heat, but even a small fire produced enough smoke to make breathing difficult. By the 2nd day, his cabin was thick with smoke, and he was coughing constantly. On the 3rd day, Silas realized he was going to die if he stayed inside. The smoke was too much. His lungs burned with every breath. His eyes were swollen nearly shut. He couldn't sleep because lying down meant breathing the densest smoke. He made a decision that seemed insane, but was actually his only chance at survival. He would abandon his cabin during the blizzard and try to reach another trapper's shelter. He knew Matthias's cabin was roughly 4 miles northwest, 4 miles through waist-deep snow in blizzard conditions, with visibility near zero. The trek had taken him nearly 8 hours. He had followed the river, knowing that as long as he kept water on his left, he was going generally the right direction. He had fallen dozens of times. He had seriously considered stopping and letting the cold take him because continuing seemed impossible. But somehow he had kept moving, one step after another, until he saw smoke rising impossibly clean from a chimney that looked wrong, and he knew he had found Matthias Kern's cabin. Silas stayed with Matthias for 3 days while he recovered. During that time, he studied the chimney cap obsessively. He went outside repeatedly to look at it from different angles. He asked Matthias detailed questions about how it was built, what it cost, where the iron came from, and most importantly, whether it had worked during the blizzard. Matthias told him the truth. The chimney had performed perfectly for 3 days. Not once had smoke entered the cabin. Not once had he worried about suffocating or freezing. Silas's response was quiet but intense. He said he had laughed when he heard about Kern's stupid chimney. He had thought Matthias was a fool for spending $70 on unnecessary ironwork. Now he understood that the real fools were men like himself who built chimneys the traditional way and hoped they wouldn't die when winter turned severe. When Silas Hartwell returned to his own cabin in late January, he found the interior coated in thick black soot and his supplies ruined by days of smoke exposure. He spent 2 days cleaning, then made the journey to Fort Benton. Nathaniel Cross was surprised to see a trapper requesting custom ironwork in the middle of winter, but when Silas explained what he needed and why, Cross understood immediately. He had heard that Matthias Kern survived the blizzard of '43 in complete comfort. Now he was hearing how Silas nearly died in the same storm. Cross fabricated a second chimney cap system, this time with more efficiency because he understood the design. Word spread quickly through the scattered trapping community. By spring of 1843, 5 more trappers had commissioned caps from Cross. By fall, he kept the components in stock as standard inventory. Trappers started calling them Kern caps, though Matthias never asked for recognition or payment for the design. He had solved the problem for himself. That others benefited was simply practical sense. Jacob Pine adopted the design in the summer of 1843 and became its most effective advocate. He was respected among mountain men for his experience and judgment. When Pine said something worked, people listened. He told anyone who would hear that the Kern cap was the single most important survival innovation he had seen in 15 years on the frontier. He had survived the blizzard of '43 with his traditional chimney, but barely, spending 3 days in smoke-filled misery. He would never face another winter without a proper cap. Even Elias Drummond eventually built one, though he never admitted he had been wrong. He simply showed up at Fort Benton in the fall of 1844 and commissioned the ironwork without comment. Cross mentioned it to Matthias months later. They both understood what it meant. The stupid chimney had become standard practice. The design spread beyond the immediate trapping community. Settlers moving into Montana Territory in the late 1840s discovered Kern caps on abandoned trapper cabins and recognized their superior function. Frontier guides and traders carried knowledge of the design to other regions. By the 1850s, variations of the elevated cap system appeared on cabins throughout the northern Rockies, the Cascade Range, and even parts of Alaska, where Russian traders adapted the principle for their outposts. Matthias left the mountains in 1847. The fur trade had collapsed, beaver populations were depleted, and he had saved enough money to start a different life. He married Lydia Brennan, a widow he met in Oregon City, and established a small farm in the Willamette Valley. They raised 3 children who never knew their father had once lived alone in the wilderness, building things that saved lives. He died in 1868 at age 54 from pneumonia, surrounded by family who mourned him as a good man and reliable farmer. His obituary in the Oregon Spectator made no mention of chimneys or innovation, but in the mountains he had left behind, cabins still stood with iron caps elevated above stone chimneys, gaps allowing smoke to escape regardless of wind, and trappers and settlers staying warm through blizzards that would have killed them in earlier decades. The stupid-looking design that cost $70 and invited ridicule had become the difference between survival and death across thousands of square miles of frontier territory. Matthias Kern had proven that the best solutions often look wrong until the moment they save your life.